Her own father sold her like a commodity, signed, sealed, handed her over, without a word. Lenora Hale, 21, thought she understood the harsh realities of life on the frontier, but no one could have prepared for the moment of seeing her father's signature on a marriage contract, trading her for gambling debts. And on the very day the agreement was sealed, the most dangerous man in the land rode into town. His name was Rhett Maddox, and he hadn't come to save her. Like, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The morning Lenora Hale turned 21, her father gave her a pair of worn leather gloves and told her to mend the fence along the eastern pasture before noon. She didn't ask why. She never asked why anymore. She pulled on the gloves, picked up the wire cutters from the hook beside the barn door, and walked out into a sky that was already pale and colorless at 7 in the morning, the kind of sky that didn't promise anything. The ground was hard and cracked under her boots. It hadn't rained in 6 weeks, and the pasture grass had gone the color of old straw, bent and brittle and rustling with a wind that carried nothing useful. No moisture, no relief, just fine red dust that settled into the creases of her knuckles and the corners of her eyes. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. The Hale homestead sat on the western edge of Darrow County, 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, which was a place called Caldwell Flat. The ranch wasn't much: a 2-room house with a sagging porch, a barn that listed slightly to the left like it was listening for something, a chicken coop, and 3 corrals that held whatever livestock her father hadn't lost or sold yet. They had 11 cattle now. They'd had 32 the previous spring. Lenora knew exactly where the others had gone. She'd seen the ledger. Her father, Calvin Hale, kept his ledger in the bottom drawer of the oak desk he'd hauled out from Missouri 20 years ago, when he'd come west with her mother and high ideas about what the frontier could give a man willing to work for it. Her mother had died of fever when Lenora was 9. The high ideas had died somewhere around the same time. What remained was Calvin, 53 years old, with the kind of face that looked like it had been left out in the elements too long, seamed and leathered and carved with resentments he'd never once examined. He drank. He gambled. He lost. Lenora had looked at the ledger 3 weeks ago when her father had been sleeping off a drunk in the barn. The numbers had made her throat close up. $1,200. That was the debt. A specific, itemized column of losses spread across 6 different creditors in Caldwell Flat, including one name she didn't recognize at the bottom: Harlan Voss. The amount beside that name was $640, and it was underlined twice. She hadn't asked her father about it. She'd learned early that asking her father direct questions about money produced either silence or rage, and neither one told her anything useful. She finished the fencing at 10 past 10 and walked back to the house. Her hands ached. She pulled off the gloves at the porch step and beat them against her thigh to knock the dust out, and that was when she noticed the horse tied at the hitching post that hadn't been there when she left. It was a bay, well-fed and well-kept, with a polished saddle that cost more than anything on the Hale property. Not her father's horse, not any horse she recognized. She went inside. Calvin was at the kitchen table. Across from him sat a man she'd never seen before, thick through the chest and shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to people being careful around him. He was wearing a dark wool coat despite the heat. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, and he had the fingers of a man who hadn't done manual labor in some time, smooth, well-tended, one of them bearing a heavy gold ring. Her father looked up when she came in. There was something in his eyes she couldn't quite read. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like the particular discomfort of a man who has already done a thing and is trying to decide how to frame it. "Lenora," he said, "come in. Sit down." She didn't sit down. She stayed near the door with her gloves in her hands and looked at the stranger. "This is Mr. Denton Grable," her father said. "He's come from Caldwell Flat." The man named Grable looked at her the way a person looks at furniture they're considering buying. Appraising, impersonal, not unkind but not warm either. He nodded once. "Miss Hale," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, a man who had nowhere to be. "Mr. Grable," she said. Her father cleared his throat. He picked up his coffee cup and put it down without drinking from it. "Mr. Grable works for Harlan Voss," he said. You may have heard the name. I've heard it. Mr. Voss he's a businessman. Cattle, mostly. He has holdings across 3 counties. Calvin was speaking carefully, the way he did when he was managing something. When he was steering her toward a conclusion he'd already reached without her. He's been generous enough to extend me some credit over the past year and, well, he stopped, rubbed the side of his jaw. Well, the situation has become something that needs to be resolved. Lenora looked at her father for a long moment. Then she looked at Grable. What kind of resolution? She asked. Grable reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the table. He smoothed it open with both hands. It was a single page, dense with handwritten text, with 2 signature lines at the bottom. One of them already had her father's signature on it. The other was blank. She didn't move toward the table. That's a marriage contract, she said. It's a settlement agreement, Grable said. Mr. Voss is willing to absorb your father's outstanding debts in their entirety, $1,240. The ranch, the land, the livestock, all of it stays in your family's possession, free and clear. He paused. In exchange for your hand in marriage. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the chickens made a sound. Lenora looked at her father. Calvin Hale was looking at the table. You signed it, she said. He didn't answer. Papa? Her voice came out flat and hard. You already signed it. The debts are... Lenora, you don't understand the pressure I've been under. Voss has men who collect on these things. Real men, not just lawyers. I didn't have a choice. You didn't have a choice, she repeated. He's a wealthy man. He'll provide for you. You'll have a house, security. You've never had security. You know that. Here, you're working yourself to the bone for a piece of land that's half dead anyway. She stared at him. She tried to find something in his face, some evidence of conflict, of pain, of a man who had struggled with this and made a terrible decision out of desperation rather than indifference. She looked for a long time. She found nothing that satisfied her. When is this supposed to take place? She asked, turning back to Grable. Mr. Voss will arrive in Caldwell Flat in 4 days' time, Grable said. He'd like the formalities completed before the end of the week. There's a judge he's arranged. The judge he's arranged, she said. So even the law is part of this. Grable's expression didn't change. Mr. Voss is thorough. She picked up the contract from the table. She read it, all of it, every line, while the 2 men sat and the kitchen stayed quiet and the dust-colored light moved slowly across the floor. She was not a slow reader. Her mother had made sure of that in the years before the fever. She'd pressed books into Lenora's hands the way other women pressed food, like reading was something the body needed to survive. The contract was airtight, in the way that things written by lawyers for powerful men tend to be airtight. Her father's debts were listed. The terms of their cancellation were listed. Her name appeared 4 times, so not as a party to the agreement, but as the consideration, the thing being exchanged. She set the contract back on the table. I need to think about this, she said. There isn't much to think about, Grable said, not unkindly. The alternative is that Mr. Voss calls the debts due in full. That means the land, the house, everything. Your father would have nothing. Then my father would have nothing, she said. Calvin's head came up sharply. Lenora, I said I need to think. She looked at Grable. You'll have an answer by morning. A very small pause. Then Grable folded the contract again and put it back in his coat. By morning, he agreed. He rose from the table, unhurried, and put on his hat. I'll be at the Darrow station. You know where that is. I know where it is, she said. He left. She listened to the bay horse's hooves on the hard ground until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she turned to her father and said quietly, How long have you been planning this? Calvin opened his mouth. Don't. She held up one hand. Don't tell me it wasn't planning. You have his man's address. You've been in correspondence. You arranged this. She dropped her hand. How long? He looked at the wall past her shoulder. 3 months, he said. 3 months. She'd been working that fence every morning for 3 months, hauling water, patching the roof after the last storm, cooking his meals and mending his shirts and rising before dawn every day without complaint, believing, she'd actually believed, that they were working towards something, that the lean years were something to get through together. She went to her room and closed the door. She did not cry. She'd learned by the time she was 12 that crying at problems on the frontier was a waste of water. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the small window that faced east toward the cracked and fading pasture, and she made herself think clearly. Grable would go back to the station. Her father would drink himself to sleep by 8 o'clock. In the morning, if she hadn't signed, Grable would return with whatever kind of pressure Harlan Voss kept on hand for situations like this one. She had one night. She waited until the lamp in her father's room went out, and then waited another hour after that, until his snoring was deep and even and uninterrupted. Then she moved through the dark house with the particular practiced silence of someone who had spent years not waking a sleeping man whose moods were unpredictable. She took her canvas bag from under the bed. She packed what mattered: 2 changes of clothes, her mother's small folding knife, a bar of soap, a half-eaten loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and the $11.30 she'd been saving in a tin inside her boot. She took her father's raincoat off the hook by the door because it was better than hers, and she had no sentimental feeling about taking it. She took the wire cutters and put them in the outside pocket of the bag because a tool was a tool, and she might need one. She did not take the contract. She did not leave a note. She went out the back door and walked to the barn and saddled the old roan mare that was technically her father's horse, but that she had fed and groomed and cared for every single day for 4 years. She figured that made it close enough to hers. She led the mare out of the barn quietly, walked her a 1/4 mile down the back trail before mounting up, and then she pointed her east toward Caldwell Flat. Not because she wanted to go there, but because the road ran through it, and she needed the road to get anywhere else. The night was cold. The stars were sharp and thick above the open land, the kind of night sky that made the world look enormous and indifferent, which it was. She rode. Caldwell Flat. In the early morning looked the way most frontier towns looked, functional and unfinished, as though the people who built it had always meant to come back and do a better job, but never quite got around to it. The main street was packed dirt with a lumber walkway on each side. There was a general store, a feed merchant, a lawyer's office, a saloon that didn't have a sign but didn't need one, a barber, a telegraph office, and a building at the far end with a faded hand-lettered sign that said Darrow County Courthouse, which was ambitious for what was essentially a converted hardware store. Lenora arrived just after first light, when the street was still mostly empty. She tied the roan at the post outside the general store, bought a tin of crackers and a sack of dried apples with 2 of her $11, and sat on the walkway to eat and think. She needed money. Real money, not $11. Enough to get herself further west, where Harlan Voss's name and reach might not extend. She had skills. She could ride, she could handle livestock, she could fix nearly anything mechanical if she had enough time and the right parts. She'd heard there were ranches west of the Seco Range that hired on women as hands, which was unusual enough to be notable, which meant they were either desperate or decent, and she'd take either. She was working through the logistics, the distance, the cost of the road, whether she could sell the roan without her father catching up to her first, when the sound hit the street. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in the quality of the air, the way a room goes quiet when something walks in that everyone already knows about. She looked up. He came in from the north end of the street on a black horse that was too good for this town, moving at a walk, unhurried, the way a man moves when he isn't worried about what's waiting for him because he's already assessed it and found it manageable. He was tall in the saddle, lean, with a dark hat pulled low enough that she couldn't see his eyes yet. He wore a long trail coat that was dusty at the hem and clean at the shoulders, which meant he'd been riding hard and recent. There were 2 guns on his belt, and the way he wore them, balanced, settled, like they were just part of his anatomy, told her they weren't decorative. The 2 men who'd been arguing outside the feed merchant stopped arguing. One of them stepped back off the walkway into the doorway. The other just stood very still. The man on the black horse rode the length of the street without stopping, without looking at anyone directly, and tied up outside the saloon that didn't have a sign. He stepped down from the saddle and rolled his shoulder once, like something ached in it, and then he pushed through the saloon door and was gone. The 2 men outside the feed merchant looked at each other. "Rhett Maddox," one of them said. The way he said it wasn't excitement. It was the tone a man uses when he says rattlesnake. Lenora filed the name away. She was still thinking about it 20 minutes later when Grable found her. He came from the direction of the station, on foot this time, with two men walking behind him who were not dressed like businessmen. They were dressed like men who got paid to be present at conversations as a form of emphasis. Grable stopped in front of her. He looked at her bag. He looked at the horse. "Miss Hale," he said, "I'm glad you came to town. It saves some time." "I came to town for provisions," she said. "I see." He didn't believe her and didn't pretend to. "I thought perhaps you'd reconsidered and decided to move things along." "I haven't signed anything," she said. "No." He glanced at the two men behind him, then back at her. "But your father has, and the terms of the agreement are fairly clear about what happens if the other party fails to appear. The debts become immediately collectible, with interest." He paused. "The interest is considerable." "That sounds like a problem for my father," she said. "He's not a young man," Grable said. There was no threat in his voice. He was just presenting information, which was somehow worse. He wouldn't survive the collections process well. These things can become uncomfortable for a family. She held his gaze. "I'm not his family," she said. "He made that clear yesterday." Something shifted in Grable's face. Not sympathy, something more businesslike. He was recalculating. "Miss Hale," he said, "Mr. Voss is a practical man. He prefers things to go smoothly. If you have concerns about the arrangement, I'm sure those can be—" "I'm not marrying Harlan Voss." Grable stopped. "I'm not signing that contract," she said. "And I'm not going to marry a man I've never met so my father can pay his gambling debts. Whatever the consequences of that are for my father, those are his consequences." She picked up her bag. "We're done talking." She stood up. And that was when the saloon door opened across the street and Rhett Maddox walked out. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Grable, or more specifically, at the two men behind Grable. A slow, measured look that moved from one to the other, like he was taking inventory. Then he leaned his shoulder against the post outside the saloon and folded his arms and said nothing, just stood there watching, and the two men behind Grable shifted their weight, and the morning got about 10 degrees tighter. Grable turned. He saw Maddox. Something happened in his expression, a flicker of recalculation that was more significant than the one Lenora had just provoked. "Maddox," Grable said, carefully neutral. "Grable." Maddox's voice was lower than she'd expected. Even. Not particularly friendly. "Didn't know you were working for Voss now." "That's not your concern." "Maybe not." He was still looking at the two men, not at Grable. "You want to tell your boys to ease up a little? They're making the morning feel crowded." A pause. Grable made a very small gesture with his hand, and the two men took one step back each. Maddox looked at Lenora for the first time. It was a brief look, practical and assessing, the way he'd looked at the two men, though what he was assessing was different. He looked at the bag in her hand. He looked at her face. Then he looked back at Grable. "She got somewhere to be?" he asked. "That's a private matter," Grable said. "I'm asking her." Lenora was not accustomed to strangers inserting themselves into her business. She wasn't sure if this one was helping or just adding a new complication. But Grable's expression had changed in a way that was informative. He was measuring something, weighing something. And whatever Rhett Maddox's presence cost her, it was clearly costing Grable something too. "I'm leaving town," she said. Maddox nodded, like that was a reasonable answer. He unfolded his arms and straightened up off the post. "Then I won't keep you," he said. He looked at Grable. "Nice seeing you, Denton." The tone made clear it wasn't. He went back inside the saloon. The two men behind Grable looked at each other. Grable looked at the saloon door for a moment, and then he looked at Lenora, and his expression had settled back into that particular businesslike smoothness, but something underneath it had changed. "Think carefully, Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Voss is a patient man, but patience has limits." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She walked to her horse and untied her and mounted up. And she did not hurry because hurrying would tell them something she didn't want them to know, which was that her hands had gone slightly cold inside her father's raincoat, and her heart was doing something uncomfortable in her chest. She rode south out of Caldwell Flat at an even pace and did not look back. She rode for the better part of 2 hours before she let herself think about what came next. The country south of Caldwell Flat opened up into a broad basin, flat scrubland with occasional outcroppings of red rock and stands of cedar that provided the only real cover for miles. It was ugly country in the way that honest country tends to be ugly, nothing wasted on decoration, all of it concentrated on simple endurance. Lenora felt a kind of sympathy for it. She had a general idea of the territory. She'd been this far south maybe twice in her life, both times with her father on cattle drives that had gone badly in different ways. There was a trading post at a place called Merrow's Crossing, about 15 miles south and slightly west, where the road forked. She could sell the horse there maybe, if she could get enough for her to afford a stage ticket further west. Or she could keep the horse and save the money, at the cost of moving slower and being easier to track. She was working through the calculus of it when she heard the rider behind her. She didn't panic. She didn't run. She'd learned that you can tell a lot about a rider's intentions from how they approach. Fast meant they wanted to close the distance before you could react. Slow and cautious meant they were watching you the same way you were watching them. This one came at a medium canter, not closing fast but not lagging, the kind of pace that said, I know where you're going and I'm just staying in range. She turned in the saddle. Rhett Maddox. He caught up to her and slowed his black horse to match her roan's pace. He didn't say anything immediately. He rode with her for maybe 2 minutes in silence, while the scrubland moved past on both sides, and a hawk turned slow circles in the pale sky above the rock formations to the west. She decided to speak first because she didn't like silences that other people got to define. Are you following me? She said. Not a question. A statement she was waiting for him to either confirm or deny. Seems like, he said. Why? Grable's going to send those 2 men after you. You probably figured that. I figured that. They're not smart men, but they're persistent, and they know this territory. She looked ahead. And you're what? Offering to help? He seemed to think about how to answer that. I'm going south anyway, he said finally. Merrow's Crossing. You? Through it. Then I'm heading the same direction, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He glanced at her, and in the full daylight she could see him more clearly than she'd been able to in town. He was somewhere north of 30, with a face that had been shaped by a lot of weather and a few things that weren't weather. A faint scar along his left jaw, a crook in his nose that had been broken at some point and healed slightly off-center. His eyes were gray and direct and did not seem particularly interested in making her comfortable. I don't know you, she said. No. You're Rhett Maddox. Yes. I've heard things. I expect you have. She waited, but he didn't offer to explain or correct whatever she'd heard, which was either honestly or arrogance, and she couldn't tell which yet. What's your connection to Grable? She asked. We've crossed paths. The way he said it suggested that crossing paths had not been pleasant for one or both of them. And Harlan Voss? A pause, fractionally longer than the others. I know who he is, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her straight for a moment with those gray eyes. That's a longer conversation, he said. Well, she said, we've got 15 miles. He almost smiled at that. She noticed it because it changed his face briefly into something less armored. Fair enough, he said. He didn't tell her everything in those 15 miles. She didn't expect him to. But he told her enough. That Harlan Voss had been buying up land in Darrow County and the 2 counties east of it for the better part of 3 years. Not always through clean means. That Grable was his man for transactions that needed a certain kind of handling. That there were homesteaders and ranchers across a 60-mile stretch of frontier who'd found themselves suddenly in debt to Voss in ways they hadn't fully understood when they took the initial credit. How do you know all this? She said. I pay attention, he said. That's not an answer. He looked at the road ahead. I've been looking into Voss for a while, he said. Not for anyone. For myself. He took something from someone I knew. He paused. A long time ago. The something was a piece of land. The someone didn't survive the process. She absorbed this. So this is personal. Mostly. And my situation is useful to you somehow. He didn't flinch from it. Might be, he said. Grable's running a marriage contract through this county right now. That's nuts. That's not just about your father's debts. That's about your family's land. He looked at her. Your father have papers on that property? Title, deed, anything? He has a deed, she said slowly. Or he did. I haven't seen it recently. You might want to find out where it is, he said. Because I'd wager that marriage contract has a clause in it you didn't get to the end of, about property transfer. She thought about the contract. She'd read every line, or she'd thought she had, but she hadn't gotten past her own name appearing 4 times as the consideration. She hadn't thought to look for what the marriage would mean for the deed to the land. Her stomach dropped. He's using me, she said. Not a new revelation, exactly, but a more complete version of it. He's using the marriage to get the land. I'm just the mechanism. That's my guess, Maddox said, and if it's right, then your situation isn't just about your father's debt. It's about a land grab that probably involves a dozen other families in this county. She stared at the road ahead. The horizon was flat and enormous, and there was nothing on it. Why are you telling me this? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She was getting a sense of how he was, the way his silences weren't avoidant so much as the rhythm of a man who didn't talk unless he had something to say. Because you're the one who has the contract, he said, or had it. And because you read it, I saw that. In the kitchen, you read the whole thing. He paused. Most women in your position would have panicked. You read the contract. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation. It didn't matter. What happened to the person Voss took the land from? She asked. Maddox looked at the road. Dead, he said, simply, without drama. 3 years ago, ruled an accident. He didn't say whether he believed that ruling. She didn't ask. They rode in silence for a while, the scrubland opening into something flatter as the morning climbed toward midday and the heat came up off the ground in slow waves. The roan was starting to labor a little. She was a good horse, but not young, and Lenora eased her pace. She was thinking about her father, not with grief exactly, more with the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent years giving someone the benefit of the doubt and has finally run out of doubt to extend. Calvin Hale had made his choice. He'd made it 3 months ago when he'd started his correspondence with Harlan Voss's man. He'd made it with his eyes open, probably, because he was not a stupid man, only a desperate and finally a cowardly one. And those were different things. She was done covering for him. But if Maddox was right, if the contract was a mechanism in something larger, then her father had been used too, in a different way. He'd thought he was selling his daughter to save his ranch. He probably didn't know he was signing the ranch away in the process. That didn't make him innocent, but it made him a different kind of victim than the person he'd tried to make of her. The deed, she said, almost to herself. He keeps it in the desk. Same one as the ledger. You'd need to go back, Maddox said. I know. She paused. Not yet. No, he agreed. Not yet. She looked at him sideways. A man who everyone in Caldwell Flat had looked at the way you look at something dangerous. A man who'd ridden 15 miles alongside her without asking for anything and hadn't tried to manage her or direct her or soften anything he'd said. She wasn't naive enough to trust him completely. She'd learned too much about what trust costs to hand it out easily. But she was beginning to think that of all the complicated and dangerous things currently moving through her life, Rhett Maddox might be the least dangerous one, which was something. Merrow's Crossing appeared on the horizon as a cluster of low buildings against the flat sky, the trading post's tin roof catching the noon light, and they rode toward it without hurrying, side by side, with the dust rising quiet and red behind them, and the whole of Darrow County stretched out around them like a problem waiting to be solved. She was 21 years old. She had $11, a roan mare, and a wire cutter in her bag. She had no plan yet, but she was working on one. And she was beginning to suspect exactly one person who might help her see it through. A man with a bad reputation, a broken nose, and a reason of his own to want Harlan Voss to answer for what he'd built. That was something. It wasn't much. But on the frontier, something was generally what you had to start with. Merrow's Crossing wasn't much more than a trading post, a water trough, and 4 buildings that had been put up in a hurry and never improved on. The trading post itself was run by a man named Sutter, who was roughly the shape and temperament of a barrel that had been left outside too long, wide, weathered, and not particularly welcoming. But he kept good stock and didn't ask questions, which made him more valuable than most people Lenora had encountered in her life. She bought grain for the roan, a canteen, and a small tin of matches. She asked Sutter, carefully and without explaining why, whether anyone had ridden through from the north in the last hour. Sutter looked at her over the counter with eyes that had seen enough frontier business to know when someone was running something. "Nobody, yet," he said. "Thank you," she said. She went outside where Maddox was watering the horses at the trough. He'd taken off his hat, and the sun hit the side of his face and made him look, briefly, like a less complicated person than he was. He put the hat back on when she came out, and the effect passed. "We've got maybe 2 hours," she said. "Maybe less if Grable moved fast." "He'll move fast," Maddox said. "He's got the reward to consider." She stopped. "There's a reward?" He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite apology, but was adjacent to it. "Voss put one out this morning, before you left town, probably. Word travels in this county." He paused. $200 for your return. Unharmed, the notice said, which is Voss's version of considerate. $200 was a significant number in Darrow County. It was enough to turn friendly people unfriendly and neutral people hostile. She understood immediately that this changed the math on nearly everything. The road west, Merrow's Crossing itself, anywhere she might stop to rest or buy provisions. "Sutter know?" she asked. "Hard to say." She looked back at the trading post. Through the single window, she could see Sutter moving behind the counter, arranging something on a shelf. He hadn't sent anyone. That was either decency or he hadn't heard yet, and she couldn't afford to assume which. "We need to move," she said. "Agreed, but not west." She turned to him. "What?" "That's what they'll expect. A woman running, heading for unfamiliar territory, looking for distance." He was already checking the cinch on his saddle. "There are 3 roads west from here, and Grable knows all of them. He'll have riders on each one before nightfall." "Then where?" He looked at her. "East," he said. "Back toward the county line. There's an old mining camp in the canyon country north of Decker Pass. Harlow Camp, it was called. Nobody's worked it in 6 or 7 years. It's not on any current maps I've seen." She studied him. "You've been there." "Once, about 2 years ago." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push it. "And you think we can hold up there long enough to—" She stopped. "Long enough to do what, exactly?" This was the question she'd been circling since they left Caldwell Flat. Running was a delaying action, not a solution. Grable would keep sending men. Voss would increase the reward. Her father's deed would pass through whatever legal mechanism Voss had arranged, and by the time she got far enough west to feel safe, the land she'd grown up on would belong to a man who'd never once set foot on it. "You said you need to go back for the deed," Maddox said. "I said not yet." "The not yet is running out." He mounted up and looked down at her. "Get to Harlow Camp. Rest the horses. Figure out the next piece. The deed is evidence, if we can get it. Evidence of what Voss is actually doing, not just what he's telling your father he's doing." "And what is he actually doing?" she asked. "You said you suspected. What do you know?" "I know he's got deeds to 11 properties in this county that he's acquired in the last 3 years. 9 of those families had debt arrangements with him first." He looked at the horizon. 2 of those families are gone. Not moved on. Gone. She stood very still. "Come on," he said, not harshly. "We'll talk while we ride." She mounted the roan and they went east, off the main road and into the scrubland, following a track that was barely a track, a faint compression in the dirt that suggested wheels or hooves had passed this way years ago, and the land had almost but not completely healed over it. The canyon country rose ahead of them in the distance, red and brown and layered, the kind of landscape that looked inhospitable from far away and was in fact worse up close. Good for hiding, bad for everything else. She asked him about the 2 families that were gone. He told her what he knew, which was incomplete in the way that knowledge about things powerful men want. Kept quiet tends to be incomplete. A ranching family named Cutter, east of Caldwell Flat, who'd taken credit from a Voss associate 3 years ago, fallen behind on payments, and one morning simply weren't there. No bodies found. Ranch signed over to a holding company that traced back, after several layers of paperwork, to Harlan Voss. The second family he didn't know the name of, only that it had happened 18 months ago and that the property in question had been a piece of land sitting directly atop the only reliable water source in the southern part of the county. Water, Lenora said. Water, he confirmed. Out here, whoever controls the water controls everything around it. Any rancher within 30 miles has to either make a deal with the man who owns the creek or watch his cattle die. She thought about the Hale property, the eastern pasture that she'd been mending fence on for months, backed up against a dry gulch that ran spring water for about 6 weeks a year. Not reliable, not sufficient, but her father had always maintained they had rights to it. Water rights. She'd seen those in the ledger too, listed as an asset. Our water rights, she said slowly. Your property's water rights would matter to Voss, yes, Maddox said. More than the land itself, probably. She absorbed this. Her father had thought he was selling her to pay his debts. He'd actually been selling the water that half the ranchers in the southern county depended on, whether he'd known it or not. And those ranchers, none of them knew what was coming. None of them had any reason to connect their neighbor's strange new marriage arrangement to the future of their own access to water. He's building a monopoly, she said. That's my read. And nobody's put it together yet. People don't tend to put things together when each piece looks different from the others. A debt here, a marriage there, a family that moved on. It doesn't look like a pattern until you're looking at all of it at once. You've been looking at all of it at once. For a while now, he said. She looked at his profile, the broken nose, the set jaw, the way he watched the landscape around them with a habit that wasn't paranoia, but was something close to its more disciplined cousin. He was a man who'd been watching this particular problem for a long time alone. She wasn't sure what that had cost him, but she suspected it had cost something. The person Voss took the land from, she said. The one who died. Who was it? A long pause. The kind that means the question got somewhere real. My uncle, he said. Walt Maddox. He had a small cattle operation about 40 miles east of here. He'd been on that land for 18 years. He paused again. He took credit from Voss in a bad season. Couldn't make the payments. One night his barn burned down, and Walt was in it. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd found that people who were managing their grief about something usually didn't need to be told it was sad. They knew. So you've been building a case, she said. Trying to. His jaw tightened slightly. It's harder than it sounds when the man you're building it against owns the judge and half the county officials. Grable mentioned a judge, she said, for the marriage. Judge Arlen Pugh. He's Voss's since about 4 years back. I don't know what Voss has on him exactly, but whatever it is, Pugh doesn't make a move without checking first. She filed that. A corrupt judge made legal remedies complicated, but it didn't make them impossible, because Arlen Pugh's authority only extended so far, to the county line, roughly. Beyond that, there were federal land offices, territorial courts, channels that Voss might not have gotten his hands into yet. Might not. Do you have anything written down? She asked. The information you've gathered about the properties, the families? Some of it, not enough. Where? He patted the inside of his coat. She nodded. Then if they catch you, it's gone. That's been a concern, he said without apparent distress. We need copies, she said, and we need my father's deed, and we need to find out who else in this county is in debt to Voss, because those people have a stake in this whether they know it or not. He looked at her. You're moving fast for someone who had no plan 2 hours ago. I had a plan, she said. It was just a bad one. Running west, get far enough away, start over somewhere else. She looked at the red canyon walls growing larger ahead of them. But if what you're saying is true, then leaving doesn't fix anything. It just means Voss gets what he wants without anyone to say otherwise. Staying is dangerous, Svante. Leaving is cowardly, she said, and I've had enough cowardice for 1 week. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, he said. Not impressed exactly. More like a man who'd revised an estimate slightly upward. Then we need to move on 3 things. The deed, the other families, And we need documentation that Voss sent Grable to execute a fraudulent contract because the marriage arrangement is the piece that's going to be hardest for him to explain in a federal court. Do you know anyone at the Federal Land Office? I know someone who knows someone, he said. It's thin. Thin is what we have, she said. The canyon opened up around them as the sun passed its high point and started its long slide toward the western rock, and the air cooled by a few degrees and smelled briefly like something other than dust. Lenora's stomach reminded her that crackers and dried apple was not a complete meal. She ignored it. She was thinking about her father, not with anger now. The anger had been there in the kitchen and on the road out of the homestead, and it had done its work, burning off the last of whatever illusion she'd been maintaining about Calvin Hale. What was left was something colder and more usable: clarity. Her father had made choices. He would face the results of them. But she was not going to let those results take the land and the water rights, and through those, the livelihoods of families across the county who'd done nothing wrong except exist in the territory that Harlan Voss had decided to swallow whole. That was the thing she kept coming back to. It wasn't just her anymore. Harlow Camp was exactly as uninviting as a 6-year abandoned mining operation in Canyon Country tends to be. 3 structures remained standing, more or less: a long bunkhouse with a roof that had partially collapsed on the east end, a smaller equipment shed that was intact but padlocked with a rusted lock that Maddox dealt with in about 45 seconds using a piece of wire, and a stone building that had been some kind of foreman's office and was the most solid of the 3. The stone walls were thick, and the roof was whole, and there was a fireplace that still drew, which Lenore confirmed by crouching at the hearth and looking up and seeing a narrow slot of pale sky at the top of the chimney. "We're not lighting a fire tonight," Maddox said from the doorway. "I know," she said. "I was checking." He looked around the room. There was an old table, 2 chairs with cracked leather seats, a shelf with some rusted tins that had been empty for years, and a cot frame with no mattress. Dust on everything, and the smell of stone and old damp, but no animal activity beyond a few mouse trails in the dust along the baseboards. "It'll do," she said. She fed and watered both horses at the trough behind the bunkhouse, which still had a functioning gravity pipe from the rock face above it, one of the things that had made the mining camp viable in the first place. The water was cold and slightly mineral, but the horses drank it willingly enough. She checked the roan's left rear hoof, which had been giving her a slightly off gait for the last hour, and found a small stone wedged against the frog. She worked it out with the tip of her knife. The mare stamped once and settled. When she came back inside, Maddox had pulled both chairs to the table and spread out a folded piece of paper. She sat across from him. What he'd been keeping in his coat was a map, hand-drawn, detailed, covering the whole of Darrow County and parts of the 2 adjacent. He'd marked 11 properties in a faint pencil notation, each one with a date and a brief note. She studied it, tracking the dates. He started in the northeast, she said, 3 years ago. Worked his way west and south. The water sources. She traced a line with her finger, not touching the paper. The marked properties formed a rough arc that, she realized, wasn't random at all. It followed the watershed, the high ground that fed every creek and spring in the southern county. He's been mapping the water. Before he bought the debt, Maddox said. I think he scouted the whole county first, identified the key parcels, then figured out which owners were financially vulnerable. Gave them credit when they needed it most, at terms that looked manageable but weren't. He looked at the map. 12 to 18 months later, they're in default. And he collects. She straightened up. Our property is here. She pointed. The hill parcel sat at the southwestern edge of the arc, closing the loop. The last piece. The last piece, he confirmed. She sat back in the chair. It creaked under her. Outside, the canyon walls were going orange in the late afternoon light, and somewhere up on the rock, a bird she couldn't identify was making a sound like a question it kept asking without expecting an answer. If he gets our water rights, she said, he controls the flow to the southern pastures of at least 8 other ranches. 11, Maddox said. I've counted. Some of them don't even realize their water comes from that direction. Then they're all at risk, and they don't know it. That's the situation. She was quiet for a moment. Then, we need to warn them. We need to do a lot of things, he said, in the right order. She looked at him. The deed first. We go back to the homestead and get it. Your father will have been contacted by now. Grable will have told him you ran. He might have men watching the property. Then we go at night. He rubbed the side of his jaw. She noticed it was something he did when he was thinking rather than when he was stalling, which meant he was taking what she said seriously rather than dismissing it. She appreciated that more than she'd expected to. There's another problem, he said. There are several other problems. Which one? Your father. He looked at her evenly. What's he going to do when he sees you? Try to hold you there? Send word to Grable? She thought about Calvin Hale, the man who'd raised her in his incomplete and distracted way, the man who taught her to ride and to fix fence and to check the sky for weather, who'd also lost 30 head of cattle to gambling and signed her name to a contract without telling her. I don't know, she said honestly. He might. He's scared and he's backed into a corner and scared people do bad things, she paused. But he's also, if I can make him understand what Voss is actually doing, that the marriage isn't saving the land, that it's the mechanism for taking it. You think he'd listen? I think he might. He loved that land once. Before the drinking, before the debts. He came west for that land. My mother's buried on it. She looked at the map. I'm not counting on it, but it's possible. Maddox folded the map and put it back in his coat. We move after dark, he said. There's a back approach to your property. The Gulch Trail comes in from the south. You know it? I've walked it 100 times. Then you lead, he said. I'll follow. She nodded. They sat in the dim stone room with the canyon light dying outside and the silence settling in around them, and she was aware, distantly, practically, that she was in a ruined mining office in the middle of canyon country with a man whose reputation was built on being dangerous, and she was not afraid of him. She wasn't sure what that said about either of them. She was, however, exhausted. Rest while you can, he said, as if reading something in the way she'd gone quiet. I'll take first watch. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. Just that. Not unkindly. She took the cot frame without argument, and she lay down on the bare wooden slats with her bag as a pillow and her father's coat pulled over her, and she told herself she would close her eyes for 30 minutes. She was asleep in 4. She woke to his hand on her shoulder, brief, careful, gone the moment she stirred. 2 riders on the south track, he said quietly. He was crouched by the narrow window, his profile edged in the pale blue of early dusk. Half-mile out, moving slow, checking ground. She was on her feet. Her body ached in 3 specific places from the wooden slats, and she ignored all of them. Trackers? Good ones, he said. They're reading the ground, not just riding it. She went to the window beside him and looked. The canyon mouth was visible from here, a narrow slot of open country between 2 red walls, and she could just make out the shape of 2 riders moving along the base of the western wall, too methodical to be casual travelers. Grable's men? She asked. Or bounty riders Voss keeps separately. Either way, they followed our trail from Merrow's Crossing. He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like a problem to be solved. Can we get the horses out without them hearing? Not if they're within a quarter mile. He looked at her. There's a passage at the back of the camp, goes up through the rock, comes out on the ridge. Single file, rough going, but it leads to the North Canyon Road. The horses? Not through there. His jaw was tight. We'd have to leave them. She turned and looked at the roan through the small back window. 4 years she'd cared for that horse. She thought about the stone wedged in her hoof that she'd just worked out an hour ago. No, she said. He looked at her. There's another way, she said. We don't run. We let them find the camp. Lenora, not us, just the camp. She was already moving, thinking it through as she went. If they find evidence we were here, they'll report back to Grable. That buys us the night while they regroup. But we won't be here. We'll be on the south track, past them, while they're riding north to find us. He was very still for a moment. Then, that only works if we can get past them before they reach the camp. How fast is your horse? A pause. Faster than yours. Then we go now, while they're still at the canyon mouth, straight south, into them. Into them, he repeated. If we're moving fast enough in the right direction, We pass before they can react. They're trackers, not fighters. They'll freeze and call for backup before they draw. He looked at her for a long moment. You're guessing about that last part. Yes, she said. Another pause. Then he put on his hat. Get the horses, he said. They were mounted and out the back of the camp in under 2 minutes, circling wide around the equipment shed to keep the stone building between them and the canyon mouth for as long as possible. The light was going fast now, the canyon walls turning from orange to deep red to something close to purple, and the shadows were long and useful. She could see the 2 riders clearly now, 200 yards, maybe a little more, still moving slow, heads down to the track. One of them had a lantern that he hadn't lit yet. She looked at Maddox. He looked back. They ran. The black horse surged, and the roan, old as she was, working hard as she was, stretched out and found something in her legs that Lenora hadn't been sure she still had, and they came through the canyon mouth at a dead run, with the cold air tearing past and the red walls blurring on both sides, and she heard one of the trackers shout, a wordless sound, surprise more than anything, and she didn't look back. She bent low over the roan's neck and rode. Behind her she heard hoofbeats that were not gaining, and then they weren't behind her anymore, but she kept riding anyway, south and then east, angling away from the road, into the scrubland dark, until Maddox pulled up alongside her and said, Far enough? And she sat up and let the roan slow. The horse was blowing hard. Lenora's heart was doing something similar. In the distance, back in the direction of the canyon, she could hear nothing. No pursuit, no shouts. The 2 riders had either stopped or turned back. They'll send word, Maddox said. I know, she said. She was catching her breath. But not until morning. They'll want light to track. That gives us the night. That gives us the night, she agreed. She turned the roan east toward the Hale homestead, toward her father and the desk with the deed in the bottom drawer, toward whatever came next in a situation that had stopped making easy sense approximately 12 hours ago. Maddox rode beside her, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the stars came out thick and cold above the open country, and somewhere far to the north a coyote tested the dark with its voice and got nothing back. They reached the Hale homestead a little past midnight. Lenora had ridden this approach in the dark before. Not often, but enough that her body remembered it, even when her eyes couldn't see much beyond the pale strip of packed dirt that passed for a trail and the silhouettes of the cedar stands on either side. The Gulch Trail came in from the south the way Maddox had said, running along the dry creek bed and then cutting up a shallow rise to the back of the property, where the fence line ended at a cedar post she'd driven herself 2 summers ago. She dismounted 50 yards out and led the roan the rest of the way on foot. Maddox did the same without being asked. The house was dark. One window on the south side showed a faint amber light. The lamp in her father's room turned low, the way he kept it when he'd drunk himself most of the way to sleep, but not entirely. She'd grown up reading those signals the way other children read clocks. He's still up, she whispered. Maddox looked at the barn, the corrals, the gap between the structures, reading lines of sight. I don't see anyone else, he said quietly. Doesn't mean nobody's here. I know. She tied the roan to the cedar post. Wait here. He put a hand on her arm, not restraining, just stopping her for a second. If he calls out, we leave. We don't wait to explain. I understand. Lenora. He waited until she looked at him. I mean it. If this goes wrong, we ride. The deed isn't worth getting cornered on this property. She held his gaze. I'll be 5 minutes, she said. She went in through the back door, which had a latch that stuck on its left side and needed to be lifted slightly while pulling, a trick she'd known since she was 7. She was inside before the door made any sound worth worrying about. The kitchen smelled like coffee gone cold and something her father had burned on the stove earlier in the day. She moved through it in the dark, past the table where Grable had sat that morning. It felt like it had been longer, a week at least, though it had only been about 16 hours. And into the short hallway that connected the kitchen to the 2 rooms. Her father's door was cracked. The amber light leaked through. She went to the desk first. The oak desk sat in the corner of the main room, between the window and the cold fireplace. It was the only piece of furniture in the house that had come with them from Missouri. The only thing her father had never sold or gambled or traded away. And she'd always thought that was because it had belonged to his own father before him, and there were limits, even for Calvin Hale, to what a man could bring himself to surrender. She opened the bottom drawer slowly. It tended to squeak if pulled too fast. The ledger was there. Under it, a folded land deed wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had gone brittle at the edges. She took both. She also took, because she thought of it at the last second, a small leather notebook from the middle drawer, her father's accounts book, which listed every creditor, every debt, every date. Evidence. The kind that told a story in numbers, which were harder to argue with than words. She was folding the oilcloth back around the deed when the lamp came on full in the hallway, and her father said, "Lenora." She straightened up. Calvin Hale was standing in the hallway doorway in his undershirt and trousers, barefoot on the plank floor, holding the lamp in one hand. He looked older than he'd looked that morning. He looked like a man who'd spent the day being afraid and hadn't found anything in that experience to improve him. "You came back," he said. "I came for the deed," she said. She kept her voice even. "I'm not staying." He looked at the oilcloth in her hands and the ledger under her arm. Something moved through his face. Not anger, which surprised her. Something more like a man bracing for a blow he's decided he deserves. "Grable came back this afternoon," he said. "He told me you'd run. He wasn't pleased. I imagine not. He said Voss would call the debts in full, that we'd lose everything." "Papa." She kept her voice low and careful. "Listen to me. The marriage contract, there's a clause in it about property transfer, the land, the water rights. That's what Voss actually wants. The debt is how he got you to sign, but the deed is what he's after." Her father was quiet. "He's been doing this across the whole county," she said. 11 properties, families who took his credit and lost their land. 2 of them are gone. Not moved on, gone. Voss is building a water monopoly, and our property is the last piece he needs to close it. Calvin looked at the lamp in his hand. The flame moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. "You're saying I was tricked," he said. "I'm saying you were used, same as the others." She paused. "But you did sign it. Whatever Voss told you or didn't tell you, you signed a contract that sold your daughter without asking her." He didn't argue with that. He looked at the floor. "There's a man helping me," she said. "Rhett Maddox. He's been gathering information about what Voss is doing. We're going to try to take it to the federal land office, get the deeds invalidated, warn the other families." She tucked the oilcloth and ledger into her bag. "I need the deed so we have something to show them. Proof of what you actually own and what Voss is trying to take." He looked up. "Maddox," he said. "I've heard of him. Most people have. He's dangerous. He's the only person in this county who's been paying attention to what Voss is doing," she said. "Right now, that matters more than his reputation." Her father set the lamp down on the small table beside the hallway door and rubbed his face with both hands. He had the posture of a man who had made large decisions and was only now beginning to understand their actual dimensions. "What do you need me to do?" he said. She hadn't expected that. She looked at him for a moment. This man she'd been furious at for 16 hours, this man who had failed her in a specific and serious way. And she made herself answer practically rather than emotionally, because that was what the situation called for. "Stay here," she said. "Don't contact Grable. If he comes back, tell him I haven't returned. Buy us time. And if Voss sends someone to collect, tell them the deed is missing. You can't sign over what you can't produce." She shouldered the bag. "Can you do that?" A long pause. Calvin Hale looked at his own hands. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I can do that." She moved toward the back door. She stopped, once, with her hand on the frame. "The fence on the east pasture is fixed," she said. "I finished it this morning before Grable came." He didn't answer. She didn't wait for him to. She went out through the back door and across the dark yard to where Maddox was waiting with the horses, and she handed him the bag without speaking and mounted up, and they rode south and then east without looking back. By the time the sky started going pale gray at the edges, they were 12 miles from the homestead and moving through a stretch of broken country. Low hills with cedar and scrub oak, cut through by a dry wash that offered decent cover. They stopped in a hollow between two hills, let the horses rest, and Lenora spread the deed open on a flat rock and held it toward the graying sky to read it. It was what she'd hoped. The deed was clean and clear. Calvin Hale, sole title holder, 43 acres, including water rights to the Spring Gulch, running the eastern boundary. Dated 15 years ago, filed in Darrow County. Her mother's name was on the original purchase agreement, folded inside the oilcloth alongside it. She held the papers carefully. Maddox was looking at the ledger. He's got 12 creditors listed, he said. 6 in Caldwell Flat, 3 in the next county, and... He stopped. What? He turned the ledger so she could see. At the bottom of the creditor column, below Harlan Voss's name and the underlined $640, there was a second entry she hadn't noticed when she'd looked at the ledger 3 weeks ago. She'd only looked at the numbers then, not the names below. The second name was Denton Grable, personal loan, $200. Date, 8 months ago. He was in debt to Grable directly, she said, which means Grable had his own leverage over your father, separate from Voss's arrangement. Maddox looked up. This wasn't one creditor with an employee. This was 2 separate men working the same target from different angles to make sure he had nowhere to turn. She looked at the name. $200 from Grable, $640 from Voss. Her father hadn't just stumbled into debt with one powerful man. He'd been walked into it from 2 directions simultaneously. They planned this, she said. Specifically, they identified him and planned it. Your property was the last piece, Maddox said. They weren't going to leave it to chance. She folded the deed back into the oilcloth and put it in the bag. The anger she'd thought was spent came back, quieter this time and colder, which was worse and also more useful. Where do we go now? She asked. There's a place I know, he said. Fort Reyes, about 20 miles northeast. It's been abandoned since the Army pulled out 6 years ago, but the structures are solid. Stone walls, defensible positions, good sight lines. He paused. And there's a man there. Or nearby, a homesteader named Cass Drummond, who's been sitting on information about Voss for the better part of a year. He lost his water rights 18 months ago. He's been waiting for someone to do something with what he knows. She looked at him. You've been in contact with him. A few times. He's scared, reasonably so, but he's kept records, dates, amounts, names of Voss's men. He looked at the horizon. Combined with what you have and what I have, it might be enough. Enough for the federal land office? Maybe. Or enough for a territorial judge who isn't in Voss's pocket. He hesitated. There's a circuit judge named Harmon Galt who comes through the territory twice a year. He's due through Caldwell Flat in about 9 days. 9 days, she said. Can we stay ahead of Grable's men for 9 days? We can try. He said it without false reassurance, which she appreciated. They rode northeast. Fort Reyes had the particular silence of a place that had once held a lot of people and noise and now held neither. The parade ground was overgrown with wire grass, and the flagpole was still standing but bare, its rope long since rotted away. 3 of the barracks buildings had lost their roofs to weather in time, but the main building, a low, long structure of mortared stone that had been the officers' quarters and administration office, was intact, its windows shuttered from the inside with wooden boards that had warped but held. Cass Drummond was not at the fort itself. He was at a small homestead about a mile south, a modest operation with a one-room house, a garden, and 3 goats that came to the fence and looked at Lenora and Maddox with the open curiosity of animals that don't get many visitors. Drummond himself was a compact, wary man of about 45, with the careful movements of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had organized his life around not presenting a target. He came to the door with a rifle, and then he saw Maddox and lowered it, though not all the way. You brought someone, he said to Maddox, not friendly, not hostile. Lenora Hale, Maddox said. Her father's property is the last piece in Voss's water scheme. She has the deed and her father's account ledger. Drummond looked at her. He had dark eyes that moved quickly, the kind of eyes that were always checking exits. Hale, he said, the property south of the gulch. That's right, she said. Voss has been after that water for 2 years. Your father know what he signed up for? He does now, she said. Drummond looked at her for another second, then stepped back from the door. Come in then, he said. I've got coffee. It's bad, but it's hot. He wasn't wrong about the coffee. They spread everything on Drummond's table, Maddox's annotated map, the deed and the original purchase agreement, her father's ledger with the 2 creditor entries, and Drummond's own records, which turned out to be considerably more thorough than she'd expected. He'd been keeping a journal for 18 months, dating every interaction with Voss's people, every pressure tactic, every legal maneuver. He'd written down names of witnesses. He'd sketched property boundaries. He'd documented the moment his water rights had been transferred through a bill of sale he'd signed under what he described in careful measured language as duress. I had 2 men at my door, he said, looking at the journal entry. Not Grable, some different men. They had papers that said the water rights had been legally transferred as part of debt settlement. When I said I'd never agreed to that, one of them put his hand on his gun. He looked up. I signed. That's coercion, Lenora said. That's documented coercion, with your written account of what happened. It's my word, Drummond said, against Voss's lawyers. It's your word plus her deed plus my map plus the ledger showing coordinated debt arrangements across 11 properties, Maddox said. That's a pattern. A federal court looks at a pattern differently than it looks at one man's word. Drummond was quiet. He looked at the spread of documents on his table, and she could see him working through something. The calculation of a scared man measuring risk against the alternative, which was continuing to live under the boot of something that wasn't going to get lighter with time. There are others, he said finally, who'd talk if someone organized it. The Fremont family, 4 miles west. Old man Reyes, no relation to the fort, he lost his northeastern pasture last spring. He paused. There's a woman named Ada Cutter. Her husband was one of the 2 who went missing. She's been living with her sister in town. She won't come forward alone, but we're not asking anyone to come forward alone, Lenora said. That's the point. We bring them all to Judge Galt when he comes through, 9 days from now. Drummond looked at her, then at Maddox. You're organizing this in 9 days? We're trying, Maddox said. Voss will know something's happening. He's got people watching this county. Probably, Lenore said. But if we move fast enough and quiet enough, we might have most of it assembled before he can shut it down. She paused. I need you to help reach the other families. You know them. They trust you. Drummond picked up his coffee cup, realized it was empty, put it down. You're asking me to stick my neck out further than it already is. Yes, she said. I know that. I'm not going to pretend it's not dangerous. She looked at him steadily. But if we don't do this, Ada Cutter's husband died for nothing, and yours and everyone else's losses go permanent. The room was quiet. One of the goats outside made a sound. Drummond looked at his journal on the table. All right, he said, I'll ride to the Fremonts tomorrow morning. They decided to use Fort Reyes as their staging ground. The stone walls and the sight lines Maddox had mentioned made it defensible in a way that Drummond's homestead wasn't, and if they were going to be meeting with multiple families over the next several days, they needed somewhere that wouldn't immediately point Grable's men toward Drummond. That evening, while Maddox helped Drummond secure his animals and prepare what he'd need for the next day's ride, Lenora sat in the fort's old administration room with a stub of candle and copied out every document they had. 2 copies of each: the deed, the relevant ledger pages, Drummond's journal entries, Maddox's annotated property notes. 1 set to present to Judge Galt, 1 set to keep hidden in a separate location so that if Grable's men found one, they hadn't found everything. It took her 3 hours. Her hand cramped twice, and she worked through it. She was finishing the last page when Maddox came in and sat down across the candle from her. Drummond's going to be all right, he said. He's scared. He's been scared for 18 months. There's a difference between scared and broken. He looked at what she'd written. You copied all of it? 2 sets. She set the pen down and flexed her fingers. 1 for Galt, 1 to hide. If they take one, they haven't stopped us. He looked at her for a moment. Your father taught you that? Redundancy? My father taught me to fix fence and read cattle for sickness and get up before dawn, she said. My mother taught me to read. I taught myself the rest. What did she teach you besides reading? The question caught her slightly off guard. It was the first personal question he'd asked her that wasn't directly relevant to their situation. To pay attention to what people don't say, she said after a moment. She said that's where the truth usually lives. He seemed to consider this. She was right, he said. She began organizing the copied pages into 2 separate packets. What about you? Who taught you? My Uncle Walt, he said. Mostly. He was a patient man, methodical. He paused. Didn't deserve what happened to him. No, she said. He didn't. They sat with that for a moment. The candle moved in a slight draft, and their shadows shifted on the stone wall. 9 days is not much time, she said. No, he agreed. If Grable figures out what we're doing, he'll try to stop it. How far will Voss go, she asked. The Cutter family? The missing rancher? Is that what we're dealing with? If we push too hard, does he… I don't know, Maddox said. It was honest, which she'd come to expect from him. He's done it before, if I'm right about Walt. But that was quiet, no witnesses, a barn fire that looked like an accident. What we're building here is different. It's public, it's documented, it involves multiple families and eventually a federal judge. That makes it harder to make disappear. Harder, she said, not impossible. Nothing's impossible for a man with enough money and few enough limits, he said. But we're changing the math on him. That's all we can do. She tied the first packet closed and started on the second. We'll need someone to hold the backup copies, she said. Someone Grable wouldn't think to look at. Drummond? Too obvious. He's already on Voss's map, she thought. The woman in town, Ada Cutter. If she's willing, Grable's people wouldn't search a widow living with her sister. They wouldn't think it worth the attention. If she's willing, Maddox said, I'll go talk to her. In town? Tomorrow night, after dark. She tied off the second packet. I can get in and out of Caldwell Flat without being seen. I grew up coming into that town. He looked like he wanted to argue and decided against it. I'll come as far as the edge of town, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. The same words he'd used the night before, in the same tone. She looked at him across the candle. He was watching her with those gray eyes that didn't offer more than they intended to, and she thought that she was beginning to understand the shape of him. Not fully, not yet, but enough to trust the outline. He was a man who'd been carrying something alone for a long time and had not let it make him bitter so much as careful. There was a difference. She was still thinking about that when the sound came. A hoofbeat, then 2. Then the unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses moving fast on the approach road north of the fort. They both stood at the same moment. Maddox went to the shuttered window and put his eye to the gap in the boards. His hand went to the gun at his right hip and rested there without drawing. 4 riders, he said. His voice was quiet and flat. Coming from the north. Grable? Can't tell yet. Moving too fast for trackers. A pause. They know we're here. She picked up the 2 document packets and looked around the room. There was a gap in the stone wall near the floor in the northwest corner where a board had rotted out from the baseboard. She'd noticed it when she'd first sat down, filed it away without meaning to. She crossed to it and pushed both packets through into the space between the inner and outer wall, as far as her arm could reach. If we have to run, she said, they're in the wall. He looked at her. He'd seen what she'd done, and his expression was something she didn't have a name for yet. We're not running yet, he said. No, she agreed. She came and stood beside him at the window and looked through the gap at the riders coming in from the north. And she held herself very still, and she thought about her mother saying, the truth lives in what people don't say. And she thought about Cass Drummond's careful, frightened journal, and Ada Cutter who'd lost her husband, and 11 properties on Maddox's hand-drawn map forming an arc along the watershed like a noose being drawn slowly closed. She thought, not yet. Not if she had anything to say about it. The riders came through the fort's broken gate and into the parade ground, and in the pale starlight she could make out Grable in front, sitting straight and certain in the saddle, with 3 men fanned out behind him. He looked toward the administration building, toward the thin edge of candlelight showing through the shuttered window, and he stopped his horse. "Maddox," he called out. His voice carried clean and flat across the empty parade ground. "Miss Hale, I know you're in there." A pause. "Mr. Voss would like a conversation." Maddox said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, to her, "How fast can you get to the horses?" "Faster than you," she said. "Back door, south wall. There's a gap in the fort perimeter about 60 yards east of the gate. Leads to open country." "I know," she said. She'd walked the fort perimeter when they'd arrived. "What are you going to do?" "Have a conversation," he said. She looked at him. "Stall them," he said. 10 minutes, that's all." She held his gaze. 10 minutes, she said. She moved through the dark back section of the building toward the rear door, quiet on the stone floor, and she did not look back because looking back had never once helped her, and she'd learned that the hard way a long time ago. Behind her, she heard Maddox pull open the front door and say, in that even unhurried voice, "Grable, you rode a long way." And Grable's voice, "Not so far. You going to invite me in?" And Maddox, "Hadn't planned on it." She slipped out the back into the cold night air and ran. She got the horses and she got out through the gap in the fort's east perimeter wall and she rode south into the open country, and she did not hear gunshots behind her, which she took as the best possible sign. She gave Maddox 15 minutes instead of 10, because 10 felt too close, and she wasn't willing to leave him there without a margin. She held the horses in a dry wash 200 yards south of the fort and listened to the night, which gave her nothing useful. No voices, no shots, just the wind and the distant movement of something small in the scrub. The black horse was restless, stamping once and tossing his head, and she kept a firm hand on his bridle and said nothing because there was nothing to say to a horse that would help. At the 14-minute mark, she heard footsteps on the hard ground coming from the direction of the fort's south wall. She had her hand on the roan's saddle horn, ready to mount when Maddox appeared out of the dark at a quick walk, not running, which told her the situation behind him was controlled rather than collapsed. He took the black horse's bridle from her and swung up. "Go," he said. They went. She didn't ask until they'd put a mile between themselves and the fort, and she was sure no one was following. What happened? Grable wanted to know where the documents were, he said. He was watching the country behind them as he rode, turning to check every 30 seconds, a habit she'd noticed in him that had probably kept him alive more than once. I told him I didn't know what documents he meant. He didn't believe me. And then? And then we talked for a while about Harlan Voss and what Voss wanted and what the consequences would be for people who got between Voss and what he wanted. He paused. Grable is a man who's delivered that speech a lot. He's good at it. Were you afraid? He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't just say no the way a man trying to seem hard would. A little, he said, more concerned than afraid. There were 3 guns in that room besides mine. How did you get out? I told him the documents were at Drummond's place, that Drummond had been holding them. He said it without particular inflection. She looked at him sharply. Drummond's already gone. I told him before we settled in at the fort, if anyone came, go to his sister's in Reyes Junction and stay there. He glanced at her. I've been doing this a while. I don't leave people exposed. She let out a breath she hadn't quite known she was holding. So Grable's going to Drummond's farm. Tonight, probably. Finds it empty. Loses another few hours. He turned forward again. Buys us time. How much time? Enough, maybe. If we move tomorrow. Tomorrow was 6 days before Judge Galt was due, Popus was due in Caldwell Flat. She ran through what they still needed. Ada Cutter, the Fremont family, Old Man Reyes, whoever else Drummond had been going to contact. All of them needed to be in Caldwell Flat when Galt arrived, with their own accounts, their own evidence, enough of a collective voice that even a judge who wanted to look the other way would find it difficult. We need Drummond to reach the other families, she said. I'll get word to him tomorrow through his sister. He looked at her. What about Ada Cutter? I'm still going into town, she said. Tonight, since we're already out. He didn't argue. She'd noticed he'd stopped arguing with her about things once she'd demonstrated she'd thought them through. That was its own form of respect. Caldwell Flat at 2 in the morning was as close to empty as a town with a functioning saloon ever got. There were 2 horses outside the saloon and a lamp burning in the telegraph office, where the night man was probably asleep over his desk. The rest of the street was dark and still. Ada Cutter's sister lived on the short residential street that ran parallel to the main road, a narrow house with a kitchen garden in front and a lamp burning low in the front window, the kind of lamp that people leave on when they're not sleeping well. Which, Lenora thought, was probably every night for Ada Cutter. She knocked twice, quietly. A long pause. Then movement inside and the door opened 2 inches on a chain. A woman's face in the gap, late 30s, dark circles under her eyes, hair loose, wearing a housecoat over her dress. She looked at Lenora with the particular wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected knocks at night rarely mean good things. "Mrs. Cutter?" Lenora said softly. "My name is Lenora Hale. I'm Calvin Hale's daughter from the South property. I need to talk to you about Harlan Voss." The silence lasted long enough that Lenora thought she might close the door. Then the chain came off. Ada Cutter was a small, self-contained woman who moved like someone managing pain, not physical pain, but the ongoing effort of carrying a loss in a body that still had to get up and function every morning. She made tea without being asked because it gave her hands something to do, and she sat across from Lenora at her sister's small kitchen table and listened without interrupting. Lenora told her everything: the contract, the water rights, Maddox's map with the 11 properties, Drummond's journal, the pattern. She laid it out plainly and without drama because Ada Cutter didn't look like a woman who needed things dressed up. She needed truth in its working clothes. When Lenora finished, Ada wrapped both hands around her teacup and stared at the table. "Thomas always said something was wrong with how the water rights were handled," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when someone has cried about something enough times that they've temporarily run dry. "He tried to file a complaint with the county recorder. 2 weeks later, the barn burned." She paused. 3 weeks after that, he was gone. "I'm sorry," Lenora said. "What do you need from me?" Ada asked. Direct, no preamble. Lenora put the second document packet on the table, the copies she'd made in the fort, pulled from her bag. "I need you to hold these. Keep them somewhere in this house that no one would find without taking the place apart. If something happens to me or to Rhett Maddox before Judge Galt arrives, these need to survive." Ada looked at the packet. "And when Galt comes through? I need you to be there, with your account of what happened to Thomas, written down if you can." She paused. "I know it's asking a lot. It's asking me to stand up in front of a judge and accuse the most powerful man in this county of killing my husband," Ada said. "Yes," Lenora said. "It is." Ada Cutter looked at the lamp on the table. The flame was very still. No draft in the room, no movement. She looked at it for a long moment. "Thomas would have done it," she said. "He'd have stood up and said it plain." She picked up the document packet and held it in both hands. "I'll be there." Lenora rode back to where Maddox was waiting at the edge of town. When she came through the dark and he read something in her face, he said, "She'll do it?" "She'll do it," Lenora said. He nodded once. They turned the horses east and rode toward whatever was left of the night. The next 5 days moved in a way that felt nothing like 5 days. They felt compressed and also endless simultaneously. The particular time distortion of a period when too much is happening and none of it can be hurried. Drummond reached through his sister in Reyes Junction, spent those days on horseback, moving from property to property across the southern and eastern parts of the county. He was careful and methodical, qualities that had served him well in 18 months of frightened record-keeping and served him now in a different way. He didn't ask people to trust him. He showed them the documents, let them read what was written, let the pattern speak for itself. Some people turned him away. 3 families who'd had dealings with Voss's men said they wanted no part of it, and Drummond respected that and moved on. But 6 families said yes. 6 families who had lost water rights, land parcels, or livestock through Voss's debt arrangements. 6 families who had been separately afraid and were now learning they were separately afraid of the same thing, which changes the nature of fear considerably. Lenora and Maddox kept moving through those 5 days, staying nowhere longer than one night. They slept in a different abandoned structure each time. A hay barn, a collapsed line shack, once in a shallow cave in the canyon walls north of Decker Pass, where the rock held the heat from the previous day, and it was almost warm. They ate what they had and didn't talk about what they didn't have. The roan was holding up better than Lenora had expected. She checked the old mare's hooves every night, and the left rear was clean. On the fourth day, Maddox came back from a reconnaissance ride into the outskirts of Caldwell Flat, and his face told her something before his words did. "Voss is in town," he said. She straightened up from where she'd been examining the map. "He came himself?" "Arrived this morning. He's staying at the hotel on the main road." He sat down and pulled off his hat. There was dust in his hair and a tiredness around his eyes that had been building for days. He brought 4 men with him, not Grable's type. These are different, harder. "Enforcers," she said. "That's the word." He rubbed the back of his neck. "He knows something's happening. He doesn't know exactly what, but he's not the kind of man who waits to find out." She looked at the map. Tomorrow was the day before Galt was due. The families, the 6 who'd agreed, plus Ada Cutter, needed to be in Caldwell Flat by morning. The documents needed to be in front of Galt the moment he arrived, before Voss or Grable could intercept him, before any private meeting could be arranged, before the machinery of bought influence could be set in motion. "He's going to try to stop us tomorrow," she said. "Yes." "Can he? Legally?" "He'll try the law first, since Pew is his. Pew could issue some kind of injunction, delay the proceedings." He looked at her. "Or he skips the law entirely and just makes it difficult for people to get to the courthouse." She thought about that. 6 families on the road into Caldwell Flat, each one separately vulnerable. Voss's 4 hard men and however many local hired hands. "We need to get everyone into town tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow morning. Tonight, while Voss is settled in the hotel and his men are in the saloon." She looked at Maddox. "If the families are already there when daylight comes, staying with friends, with Ada's sister, wherever they can, then Voss can't intercept them on the road." He looked at the map, then at her. "That means you and I spend tonight moving people. Can you reach the Eastern families, the Fremonts and Old Man Reyes? If I leave now, then go." She was already folding the map. "I'll get word to Drummond and handle the Southern families. We meet in Caldwell Flat before midnight." He stood up and put his hat back on. He looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize, that slight recalibration, the revised estimate. "You've gotten good at this," he said. "I've had a good teacher," she said. "Go." He went. The night was long and complicated and involved more writing than any single night should reasonably require, but by 11 o'clock Lenore had moved the last of the Southern families, a widow named Marsh and her teenage son, who'd lost their eastern pasture to a Voss debt arrangement 8 months ago, to the house of a sympathetic friend at the edge of Caldwell Flat. She found Drummond at Ada Cutter's sister's house, which had become something like their unofficial headquarters. He was drinking the bad coffee that seemed to follow them everywhere, and he looked exhausted in a way that was also, underneath it, something resembling alive. The fear was still there. It would probably always be there, in some form, but it had been joined by something that competed with it. Maddox arrived at 11:30. He'd gotten the Fremonts and Old Man Reyes settled at the feed merchant's back room, whose owner was a man named Polk that Maddox trusted and who had his own reasons to dislike Harlan Voss that predated all of this. They gathered in Ada's sister's kitchen. Lenora, Maddox, Drummond, Ada herself, and a man named Warren Fremont who had asked to be present when the plan was finalized, an older rancher with a gray beard and the look of someone who had decided to stop being quiet about something. Fremont spread his own copy of the deed documents on the table and looked around at all of them. "What happens if Voss's men try to block the courthouse?" he asked. No preamble. A man who'd done his worrying privately and arrived at the question. "They can't block a federal circuit court proceeding," Maddox said. "Galt has his own authority. What they can do is make it chaotic and try to intimidate witnesses before they can testify." "So we go in together," Lenora said. "All of us, all the families, first thing in the morning. Galt is scheduled to arrive at the courthouse at 9. We're there at 8:30, as a group, with all the documentation, public, visible." She paused. Voss can't make 6 families and a stack of documented evidence disappear in front of the whole town. He might try, Drummond said. He might, she agreed. That's why we go together. Fremont looked at her for a moment. You're Calvin Hale's girl, he said. Yes. I've known your father 20 years. He didn't say it warmly, but he didn't say it with contempt either. Just factually, the way you state coordinates. He's made some poor decisions. He has, she said. But that land is good land. The water rights are legitimate. Your mother helped my wife when she was sick with fever, years back. He put his hand flat on the deed documents on the table. I'll be there at 8:30. Lenora looked at him. Thank you, she said. Drummond nodded. Ada Cutter said nothing, but she picked up her written account. 2 pages, careful handwriting, everything about Thomas and the barn and the water rights, and folded it neatly and put it in her pocket. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, Caldwell Flat was settling into its late-night version of itself. Somewhere on the main street a door closed and a man's voice said something, and then there was nothing. Get some sleep if you can, Maddox said. A few hours at least. Nobody argued. Lenora didn't think she'd sleep, but she lay down on the narrow cot in Ada's sister's back room and was unconscious within minutes, which was what accumulated exhaustion does regardless of what you think you're going to do. She woke at first light to the sound of raised voices outside. She was up and at the window in a single movement, still in her coat, because she'd slept in it. The street in front of the house was empty, but the voices were coming from the direction of the main road. 2 voices, she thought, and then a third. She found Maddox already at the front door. He had his hand on his gun, but hadn't drawn. Calvin Hale, he said. She looked past him. Her father was standing at the edge of the street with Denton Grable. Between them, close enough to be part of the conversation, was a man she'd never seen in person, but recognized from Maddox's description. Heavier than she'd expected, square-faced, wearing a coat that cost more than anything in this town, entirely at ease in the early morning of someone else's territory. Harlan Voss. Her father was talking. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the posture. A man being pressured, his shoulders slightly forward, the defensive hunch of someone trying to hold ground they weren't sure they had a right to. What is he doing here? She said. Maddox's jaw was set. I don't know. He wasn't supposed to be. And then Calvin Hale turned his head and looked directly at the house, directly at the window where she was standing. Her stomach dropped. Grable followed Calvin's gaze to the window. Then Voss. He told them, Maddox said. Flat. Not angry exactly. The tone of a man who had calculated a risk and found he'd been wrong about one variable. You don't know that, she said, though her voice came out thin. He brought them here, Maddox said. Whether it was intentional or not, he brought them here. She looked at her father's face across the street. Calvin Hale was looking at the house, and his expression was something she couldn't fully parse from this distance. It could have been guilt, or it could have been fear, or it could have been both operating simultaneously, which was probably the truth. Grable said something to Voss. Voss nodded once and looked at the house with the relaxed attention of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he'd been working toward for some time. Lenora turned from the window. Drummond was in the kitchen doorway. Ada Cutter behind him. We need to move, Lenora said. Now. Get everyone, all the families, everyone who's in this town. Main Street in front of the courthouse. Right now, not 8:30. She looked at Drummond. Go. He went. She turned to Maddox. He's going to try to get to Galt before we do. If Pugh intercepts Galt first and suggests a private meeting, then we don't let that happen. She was already at the door. Can you get to the courthouse ahead of them? Depends on which road Galt takes coming in from the north. Then we split. You take the north road, meet Galt on the way in, tell him what's waiting. I'll keep Voss occupied. He stopped. How are you going to keep Voss occupied? She looked at him. I'm going to talk to my father, she said. His expression didn't shift much, but something in it did. Lenora, he's scared, she said. He made a bad decision out of fear. I know what that looks like. I can work with that. She paused. Go get Galt. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he was out the back door. She went out the front. She crossed the street in the pale early light with her bag over her shoulder and the deed in her coat, and she walked toward her father and Denton Grable and Harlan Voss with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has decided to stop being chased. Voss watched her come. Up close, he was less physically imposing than she'd built him in her mind. A substantial man, yes, with the easy authority of money, but not different from other men in any way that mattered. He had a face that knew what it wanted and had mostly gotten it, which made it a face that didn't expect to be told no. Grable had his hand near his gun. She looked at it and then looked at him. "Mr. Grable," she said, "we've established I'm not easily intimidated. You might as well put your hand somewhere more comfortable." His hand stayed where it was, but his expression shifted. Voss spoke before she could address him. "Miss Hale." His voice was measured, even, the voice of a man in a meeting he controls. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the nature of our arrangement." "There hasn't," she said. "You've been buying debt across this county for 3 years. You used the debt to acquire water rights. You've ruined 11 families, and you had at least one person killed. I have documentation of all of it, and so do 6 other families in this town right now." She paused. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a documented pattern of fraud and coercion." Voss looked at her with what she could only describe as professional assessment. Not fury. He was past the kind of anger that showed on faces. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is. And I'm going to make it in front of Judge Harmon Galt in—" She looked at the sky, reading the light. "About 2 hours." A pause. She looked at her father. Calvin Hale was standing slightly behind Voss, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived somewhere and couldn't leave and wasn't sure anymore what he was doing there. "Papa," she said. He looked at her. "Did you tell them where we were?" His face worked for a moment. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Voss came to the homestead last night," he said. He said if I helped him find you, he'd clear the debts entirely and we'd keep the land, free and clear." He stopped. I rode into town. I didn't know you were at that house." Grable's face flickered. He looked at Voss. She looked at Voss too. "You told him you'd clear the debts and let him keep the land," she said. "That offer still stands," Voss said. "And what does he have to do for it?" "Persuade his daughter to see reason." She almost smiled. "He can't persuade me of anything," she said. "I'm 21 years old and I'm not his to persuade." She looked at her father. "He knows that." Calvin Hale looked at the ground. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you can't stop what's going to happen in that courthouse today. You can try. You can have Pew delay things. You can have Grable's men make the morning difficult. You can make noise. But 6 families are waiting at the courthouse right now, and Judge Galt is going to arrive and hear them. And then he's going to look at 11 property transfers and a marriage contract written to obscure a water rights seizure, and what he's going to see is fraud. Documented, witnessed, demonstrable fraud." Voss was quiet for a moment. His face hadn't changed much, but something behind it had. A subtle recalculation, the same kind she'd seen in Grable's face that first morning when Maddox had appeared outside the saloon. "You think a circuit judge is going to overturn 3 years of legal property transfers," he said, "based on the accounts of a handful of struggling ranchers." "I think a federal court is going to look at the pattern and recognize it for what it is," she said. "And I think the moment that starts, other things are going to follow. A territorial attorney, a federal land survey, questions about Thomas Cutter's death." She held his gaze. "You're very good at individual transactions, Mr. Voss. You're not so good at what happens when someone lines them all up and looks at them together." She turned to her father. "Papa," she said, "come with me." He looked at her, then at Voss, then at the ground. She waited. Calvin Hale stepped forward away from Voss. Grable moved and Voss said quietly, "Denton." Just the name. Grable stopped. Voss looked at Lenora. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's just starting." She walked toward the courthouse with her father beside her and the street around them coming awake in the early morning. Drummond's borrowed wagon turning the corner with the Marsh widow and her son, the Fremont family on foot from the feed merchant's back room, Ada Cutter walking from her sister's house with 2 pages of careful writing in her pocket. The sun was coming up over the eastern rock, and it made long shadows on the packed dirt of the main road and lit the false fronts of the buildings in a way that made them look, briefly, more substantial than they were. Calvin Hale walked beside his daughter and didn't speak. She didn't need him to. Behind them, she heard Voss say something to Grable in a low voice. She didn't look back. She listened for hoofbeats instead, the sound of a rider coming in from the north road. And at the far edge of hearing, past the waking town, she caught it. Maddox. And with him, the measured, authoritative pace of a second horse that didn't belong to anyone from Caldwell Flat. Galt was here. She kept walking, and she did not let her pace change, and she held the deed against her chest inside her coat, and she thought, 8 families, 6 days, 2 copies of everything, 1 judge who isn't owned. It was enough. It had to be. Judge Harmon Galt was not what she'd expected. She'd built him in her mind as a particular type, the frontier circuit judge, weathered and weary, the kind of man who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything and had stopped trying to fix what he couldn't reach. What arrived on the north road beside Maddox was a compact man in his late 50s with a neat gray beard and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that he wore pushed up on his forehead like he kept forgetting they were there. He had the deliberate movements of someone whose back hurt, but who'd made peace with that. And when he dismounted outside the courthouse and looked at the crowd assembled on the steps, 8 families, 30-some people, some of them clutching papers, 1 woman with 2 children holding onto her coat, he didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had ridden into versions of this before and understood what it meant. He looked at Maddox. "How long has this been building?" 3 years for Voss, Maddox said. 6 days for us. Galt pushed his glasses down to his nose and looked at the crowd again through them. "All right," he said. "Let's get inside before someone does something that makes my morning complicated." That last part was directed at the far end of the street, where Grable had positioned himself with 2 of Voss's hard men, all 3 of them watching the courthouse steps with the careful attention of people calculating whether to act. Galt looked at them the way a man looks at weather. He's decided isn't his problem yet, and went inside. Lenora followed with her father beside her and the deed against her chest, and did not look at Grable at all. The proceedings took most of the morning. Galt set himself at the converted hardware store's biggest table. Somebody had put a proper table in at some point, dark wood, scratched but solid, and he went through everything with the methodical patience of a man who knew that haste in a room full of grievances produced more heat than resolution. He read Drummond's journal. He read the annotated property map. He read the marriage contract slowly, twice, and when he finished the second read, he set it down and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "The property transfer clause," he said. "Not a question." "Section 4, Lenora said. "It transfers the water rights of the Eastern Gulch to the contracting party's estate as part of the marital settlement. My father's name is on the contract, but the land deed wasn't attached or referenced. A person reading quickly wouldn't catch it." "But you did," Galt said. "I read carefully." He looked at her over the glasses. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a particular kind of attention that meant he'd revised his assessment of the person in front of him. He took the family accounts one at a time. Warren Fremont first, then Old Man Reyes, then Drummond, then the Marsh widow, then 2 other families whose names Lenora had learned only in the past 3 days. Each one told their version. The credit arrangements, the debt, the pressure, the transfers they'd signed under circumstances that ranged from uncomfortable to outright threatening. Galt listened without interrupting. He asked precise questions when he needed to. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a stub pencil that he kept sharpening with a pocket knife without looking at his hands. Ada Cutter was last. She stood at the table without sitting down, which Galt offered, and she declined, and she read from her 2 pages in a voice that was steady throughout, except for one moment near the end when it wasn't, and then it was again. She said Thomas had documented the water rights irregularity. She said 2 men had come to their door. She said Thomas had signed the transfer under duress, and then the barn had burned, and then Thomas was gone, and the county ruling had been accidental death, and she had never believed that for a single day in the 18 months since. The room was very quiet when she finished. Galt looked at his notes. "Mrs. Cutter," he said, "I want to be clear with you about something. What you've described regarding your husband's death, The death itself falls outside the scope of what I can address today. That requires a separate investigation, a proper one. He paused. But I can tell you that what you've described will be part of the formal record of these proceedings, and that record will go to the Territorial Attorney's Office, and I will personally write a letter recommending that office open an inquiry. He looked at her. I can't promise you justice for Thomas. I can promise you that what happened to him won't stay buried in a county records office. Ada Cutter nodded once. She folded her 2 pages back into her pocket and sat down. But Harlan Voss came to the courthouse at 10:30. He didn't bring Grable. He came alone, which Lenora thought was either confidence or calculation, probably both. A man who walks into a room alone sends a message about what he thinks of everyone in it. Galt looked up when he entered. Mr. Voss, you'll need to wait outside until I call for you. Judge Galt! Voss's voice was the same measured register she'd heard on the street. I think there's been a significant misrepresentation of outside, Mr. Voss. A pause. Voss looked at the room, at Lenora, at Drummond, at the families assembled, at the documents spread across Galt's table. Something moved through his face. Not fear. A man like Voss didn't get to his position by being afraid of rooms, but something more like a person looking at a structure they'd built and realizing for the first time that it had been built on something that wasn't as solid as they'd thought. He went outside. Galt called him in 20 minutes later. Lenora stayed in the room because Galt hadn't told her to leave and she wasn't going to volunteer. The judge walked Voss through the documentation point by point. The property map, the 11 transfers, the marriage contract clause, the parallel debt arrangements in the ledger, Grable's personal loan to Calvin Hale sitting alongside Voss's, 2 hooks in the same fish. Voss had a lawyer's ability to present alternative explanations. Credit arrangements were standard frontier business practice. Property transfers as debt settlement were legal and common. The marriage contract had been signed by a consenting party. The consenting party was the father, Galt said. The subject of the contract was the daughter, who was not consulted and did not sign, though the father had legal authority. She's 21 years old, Galt said. Not loudly, just clearly. She is not a minor, and she is not property. Voss adjusted his approach. He was smooth about it. You had to give him that. He moved from defense to negotiation without visible seam, suggesting that surely there were ways to address the concerns of the families present, that Voss Holdings would be willing to revisit certain arrangements, that this could be resolved without formal proceedings. Galt looked at him over the glasses for a long moment. Mr. Voss, he said, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I'm issuing an immediate injunction freezing all property transfers connected to Voss Holdings pending a full territorial review. I'm referring the matter to the Federal Land Office for audit of the 11 transactions on this map. I'm sending the complete record, including Mrs. Cutter's account, to the Territorial Attorney's Office today. He set his pencil down. What is not going to happen is a private negotiation in this room that makes things easier for you at the expense of these families. Voss looked at him. You're going to need a better lawyer than the ones this county can provide, Galt said. I'd suggest getting one. Grable left town that afternoon. Lenora didn't see him go. She heard about it from Polk, the feed merchant, who said he'd ridden out north around 2 o'clock with his 2 men and his polished saddle and his bay horse that cost more than anything in Caldwell Flat. Whether Voss had dismissed him or whether he'd made his own calculation about which way the wind was blowing was something nobody knew for certain. Voss himself stayed in the hotel through the day, and by evening, word came through town. The way word always travels in small places, person to person, some details accurate and some invented, and the general shape of it true, that Voss Holdings had retained legal representation in the territorial capital and that Harlan Voss would be departing the following morning to address the matter there. He left without incident. No confrontation, no final threat, no scene on the main road. Just a man on a horse going north, smaller in the distance, and then gone. It wasn't a complete ending. Lenora understood that clearly and was honest with herself about it. The territorial review would take months, possibly longer. The audit of the 11 property transfers would be contested, because men with money always contest things, because the process of contesting is itself a form of pressure on people who have less to spend on waiting. Some of the families might not get everything back. The case against Voss for what had happened to Thomas Cutter might amount to something, or it might get buried in the slow machinery of territorial law. But the injunction was real. The freeze on the transfers was real. The federal land office audit was real, and federal audits had a way of finding things that local arrangements had obscured. And 11 families who had each been separately afraid now knew they were not alone, which changes what a person is willing to do and say and endure. That was real too. Maybe the most real thing. She found her father sitting on the steps of the courthouse in the late afternoon, after the families had gone back to wherever they were staying and Galt had ridden out with his complete record and his letter of recommendation and his notebook full of stub pencil notes. Calvin Hale was sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking at the main road like he was reading something in the packed dirt. She sat down beside him. They didn't speak for a while. A dog crossed the road at the far end of town, nose down, purposeful. The afternoon light was going amber. "The deed's still ours," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Galt's injunction covers it. Until the review is complete, Voss can't touch it." "I heard." She looked at his profile. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than a few bad nights. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something so long he'd forgotten it was there until someone pointed it out, and now that he knew, he couldn't unknow the weight of it. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. She thought about all the things that apology would need to cover to mean what he probably intended it to mean. 3 months of secret correspondence, a signed contract, $1,200 of debt built up over years of choices she'd watched him make and couldn't stop. A daughter worked like a hired hand and thanked less. She thought about whether sorry was sufficient for any of that. It wasn't. She knew it wasn't, and she suspected he knew it too. "I know," she said. "That's all you're going to give me?" he asked. Not angry, genuinely asking. "For now," she said. "We've got work to do on that fence before winter. The east pasture needs it. After that, we'll see." He looked at her. Then he looked at the road again. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting terms he recognizes as fair. Maddox found her at the water trough behind the feed merchants where she'd taken the roan to drink. He'd been tying up loose ends. Galt had wanted a formal written statement from him about the property map and how he'd compiled it, and Maddox had spent the better part of 2 hours at the courthouse table writing in a hand that turned out to be more careful and precise than she'd have expected. He leaned against the trough post and watched the roan drink. "She held up," he said, looking at the old mare. "She always holds up," Lenora said. "She just doesn't make it look easy." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet she'd come to understand wasn't emptiness. It was him working toward something. "I'm going to the territorial capital," he said, "when the review starts. I want to be there, give testimony if they'll take it." He paused. "And I want to look into what happened to Walt more formally, now that there's a federal record open." She nodded. "Good. That'll take some time." "I figured." He looked at her then. She looked back. There was something between them that hadn't been named and that she wasn't sure she was ready to name, partly because she was 21 years old and had just survived the most exhausting week of her life, and partly because she'd learned enough in the past 6 days about the cost of moving too fast toward things you want. "The homestead," he said. "You going to stay?" "For now," she said. "The water rights need to be secured properly once the review clears. The eastern fence still needs work. And," she paused, "the other families are going to need help navigating the review process. Most of them don't read well enough to handle the legal paperwork on their own." "You're going to help them," he said. "Not a question. Someone should," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "The ranch could use some work. The barn structure, at least, looked like the crossbeam on the east side was going soft." She looked at him. "You were inside our barn?" "Briefly, when we came for the deed." He wasn't apologetic about it. "I noticed structural things." "The crossbeam's been soft for 2 years," she said. "My father kept meaning to get to it." "I could get to it," he said. "Before I head to the capital. If you needed someone who knew what they were doing." She understood what he was actually saying, and he understood that she understood, and neither of them felt the need to make it into more than it was. He was asking if he could stay for a while. She was deciding whether to say yes. She thought about what she knew of him after 6 days. The broken nose and the gray eyes, and the patience that wasn't passivity. The way he didn't tell her what to do, but also didn't pretend she didn't need help. The story of Walt Maddox in a barn that burned, and 3 years of quietly building a case that no one had asked him to build. That he'd built anyway because it was the right thing, and because leaving wrong things alone had never sat right with him, even when the right thing was difficult and lonely, and got him exactly the reputation he'd been carrying into every town for years. She thought about her mother, who had said the truth lives in what people don't say. What Rhett Maddox didn't say in 6 days was considerable. He didn't say she was too young for this. He didn't say she was too emotional or too inexperienced, or that she should let him handle the parts that required nerve. He didn't say she was brave in the tone that means surprising, the way people say it to women when they actually mean unexpected. He just rode and planned and let her lead when she knew the way and led when she didn't, and the line between those things had stayed clean and uncomplicated throughout. That was rarer than people seemed to understand. "The crossbeam's a 2-person job anyway," she said, "if you want to be useful." He almost smiled. "I'll try," he said. They rode back to the Hale homestead in the long evening light, the 3 of them, Lenora and Maddox and Calvin, who didn't speak much but rode steadily and didn't ask to stop. The country opened up around them the way it always did when you left Caldwell Flat, heading south and west. The scrubland broad and flat and endless looking, the sky enormous above it, and going colors at the edges that didn't have names, or had names nobody bothered to use. Lenora had thought, somewhere in the middle of the worst of the week, that the frontier looked like a place that didn't care. She'd thought it was indifferent in the particular way of large things. The sky, the rock formations, the dry creek beds that held water 6 weeks a year and nothing the rest of the time. She'd thought the land had no position on what happened to the people trying to live on it. She still thought that, mostly. The land didn't care. It didn't root for anyone. But she'd learned something in the past 6 days that she was still turning over, still examining from different angles the way you turn over a rock to see what's under it. She'd learned that what looks like one person's problem is almost never one person's problem. She'd been so sure, that first morning with the wire cutters and the faded east pasture, that her life was a thing being done to her by people with more power, her father, Voss, the machinery of debt and arranged marriages and frontier law that seemed always to run in favor of whoever could afford to maintain it. That wasn't wrong, exactly. The machinery was real. The power was real. But the thing she hadn't seen, until Maddox had said the word pattern, and Drummond had opened his careful, frightened journal, was that the machinery depended on people not talking to each other. It depended on every Ada cutter grieving alone, every Cass Drummond being scared alone, every family thinking their particular loss was bad luck or personal failure rather than the intentional work of someone who needed them isolated to keep them manageable. The moment they'd talked to each other, the machinery had started to come apart. Not immediately, not cleanly, not in a way that didn't leave damage behind. But it had started, and starting was the thing. She thought about what that meant beyond this county, beyond this particular scheme, beyond Harlan Voss and his water rights and his bought judge, and his smooth-voiced man with the polished saddle. She thought it probably meant something larger than she could fully see from where she was standing at 21, on a tired roan mare, riding toward a homestead with a sagging porch and a barn crossbeam that needed replacing. Maybe that was enough to start with, seeing the part of it you could see and doing the work that was in front of you. The homestead came into view as the last light left the sky. The listing barn, the crooked porch, the 11 remaining cattle standing in the near corral looking at nothing. The east pasture fence ran along the horizon in the dark, the part she'd fixed that first morning before the world had changed, wire tight and cedar posts solid and holding. She'd done that part right, at least. She dismounted and led the roan to the barn and unsaddled her and checked the left rear hoof and found it clean. She gave her grain and water and ran a hand down the old mare's neck once, briefly. Not a sentimental gesture so much as an honest one. "Good girl," she said. Just that. Behind her she heard Maddox in the barn with his black horse, the quiet sounds of a man who knows how to care for an animal doing it without being asked. Her father was at the house, a lamp coming on in the kitchen, the smell of old wood and cold air, and the particular combination of things that had always been the smell of home, for better or for worse. She stood in the barn door for a moment and looked at the dark property around her. The land, the fence, the water rights on paper and the oilcloth in her bag. All of it still theirs. Uncertain, contested, unresolved in the ways that large things take time to resolve, but present, still here. Nobody gets to decide what your life is worth. That's the thing she'd learned in 6 days that she thought she might spend a long time learning the full dimensions of. Not your father, not a man with a gold ring who'd never set foot on your land, not the accumulated weight of debt and bad luck and a frontier that ground people down as a matter of course. You decide, by how you move, by who you talk to, by whether you read the whole contract, even the parts that are hard to look at, by whether you stay and fight or run and let someone else define what you were. She'd stayed. The stars came out above the Hale property, thick and cold and enormous, the same stars that had been there every night of her life, indifferent as always, taking no position. She'd just finally stopped waiting for them to.